Welcome to Warhammer 40,000 Lore to Sleep To. Today we'll be exploring the origins and other details of Jaghatai Khan, Primarch of the White Scars Legiones Astartes. So lie back, relax, and let's begin. The fire-eyed child of the steppe. There is a world at the edge of the Emperor's light, a world of vast windswept plains and skies so wide, they seem to contain the whole of time. It was called Chogoris by its people, and later Mundus Planus by the cartographers and administratum clerks who would one day catalogue it in the ledgers of the Imperium. That second name is a flat and colourless thing, utterly inadequate to describe the place it names. Mundus Planus, the plain world. As though a world could be plain. As though any world that produced what Chogoris produced could be called by such a word without irony. The plains of Chogoris were not gentle. They were not the soft temperate grasslands of more comfortable worlds. They were enormous and exposed, swept by winds that carried ice and grit in equal measure, home to creatures that did not hesitate to kill and to people who had learned over countless generations to match them. The sky above Chogoris was a presence rather than a backdrop. Immense, ever-changing, the most constant and least predictable thing in a world that offered very little comfort. To live on Chogoris was to live in motion, to live exposed, to live in a perpetual negotiation with a landscape that made no allowances for weakness. It shaped the people who lived there into something hard and spare and deeply alive. It was, in retrospect, exactly the kind of world on which a Primarch could be forged. He did not begin with a throne. He did not begin with a legion, or a fleet, or even a name that history would remember. He began in the dust of the empty quarter, that most forbidding region of Chogoris. A vast expanse of arid steppe so punishing that most of the planet's tribes gave it a wide berth and spoke of it in the register of places best avoided. Into this emptiness, a child had come. How, no record says with certainty. The Primarchs were scattered from the Emperor's side by the machinations of the Chaos Gods, sent spinning across the galaxy in their gestation capsules to land wherever fate or malice decided. The empty quarter received its cargo without ceremony. It was On Khan, chieftain of the Talaska tribe, who found him, or perhaps who was found by him, in the way that certain kinds of people seem to attract what they are ready for. On Khan was not a man who made sentimental decisions. He was a leader of nomads on a world where a bad decision could mean the death of everyone who depended on you, and sentimentality was a luxury the steppe did not permit. And yet he took the child in. Gave him a place beside the fire. Gave him the name of a son. Perhaps he saw, even then, the thing that others would later describe with wide eyes and careful words. Perhaps he simply understood that some things are too significant to leave lying in the dust. There is a phrase that recurs in the oral histories of the Talaska, passed down through generations of saga tellers who would carry the memory of their most famous son, long after he had departed for the stars. They speak of the fire in his eyes. Not metaphorically, or not entirely. There was something in his gaze that the people of the steppe, who were not given to poetic exaggeration about practical matters, found genuinely difficult to account for in ordinary language. Something luminous. Something that looked, when it fixed upon you, as though it was seeing considerably more than the surface of whatever it rested on. Among the nomads of Chogoris, there were traditions for recognizing the divinely favored. The shamans and spirit speakers of the steppe had their methods, their signs, their inherited vocabulary for the presence of something beyond the ordinary. And the boy drew that vocabulary out of them almost immediately. They did not treat him with the wariness that strangeness might otherwise invite. They treated him with the particular combination of reverence and affection that the Chogorian people reserved for those they believed the spirits had marked. He was one of theirs. He was also something more. They held both truths simultaneously, as people who live close to the sky learn to hold things lightly, and without needing to resolve the contradiction. The first sign that the boy was something beyond ordinary was not his strength, though that came early and was remarkable enough. It was not his speed, though the children of the Talaska quickly learned that racing him was an exercise in accepting defeat gracefully. It was something quieter, and in its own way more unsettling. He knew things before he should have known them. A raiding party moving through the dark, 3 hours' ride away, making no sound that any scout had yet detected, and the boy would rise from his sleeping mat and say, simply, that riders were coming from the Eastern Passage. He said it the way one states a fact already established, a thing already seen. And when the Talaska sentries went to look, they found exactly what he had described. He could feel the shape of coming events the way a seasoned navigator feels a change in the wind, not with certainty, not as prophecy carved in stone, but as a strong, consistent sense of what the next moment contained. The shamans of the tribe had a name for this gift. They called it the eye behind the eye. They said the spirits gave it only to those they wished to use. Whatever its source, it served the Talaska well, and it served the boy himself better still, in the years to come when the stakes of being wrong were considerably higher than a lost night's sleep. He had always been drawn to wild things. Not in the way of a collector or a conqueror who wishes to possess and display, but in the way of someone who recognizes kinship in unexpected places, who sees in the untamed creature something that speaks to a corresponding untamedness within himself. The beasts of Chogoris were not gentle. The gerfalcons that rode the thermals above the empty quarter were apex predators, hooked and fast and utterly indifferent to human approval. The thunderwolves that ranged the deep steppe were larger, more dangerous still, great predators that the tribe spoke of with the careful respect due to something that could kill you efficiently and without particular malice. He walked towards them. That is, in the end, the simple fact of it. Where other children of the Talaska kept their distance, where even experienced hunters gave the thunderwolves a careful berth, the boy walked towards them with the steady, unhurried gait of someone who has decided that fear is not the appropriate response to this situation. And the animals, with whatever instinct wild creatures possess for reading the deeper truth of a living thing, let him come. The gerfalcons settled on his arm. The thunderwolves circled him, and then Saturday. It was not dominance and it was not magic. It was something harder to name, a recognition, perhaps, moving in both directions simultaneously. He was one of them, after a fashion. They knew it before he did. That bond, formed in the dust and wind of the empty quarter, did not end with his childhood. It persisted through the decades of conquest that followed, through the reunification of Chogoris, through the meeting with the Emperor and the founding of the White Scars, through the long centuries of the Great Crusade and beyond. Wherever the Khan went, the hunting beasts came with him, or their successors did, new animals found on new worlds, brought aboard the Swordstorm and kept in the private aviary he maintained throughout his years of command. Those who served him closely understood this not as a quirk or an affectation but as something essential to him, a thread that ran unbroken from the boy on the steppe to the Primarch among the stars. There is a certain kind of truth that a person learns from animals which cannot be learned from books or councils or the careful exchange of political positions. Animals do not negotiate. They do not maintain a public face inconsistent with their private one. They are entirely what they are, operating from instinct and need and the accumulated wisdom of their species, and they respond to what they perceive rather than what they are told to perceive. For a man who spent his whole life suspicious of the gap between appearance and reality, between institutional purpose and institutional practice, there was something clarifying in that honesty. He trusted what the beast showed him. He was not always so certain he could say the same of men. The grief arrived, as grief tends to, without warning and without mercy. Khan was murdered. The details that survive speak of the Karaid tribe, rivals of the Talaska, old enemies with old grudges, who moved against the aging chieftain when they believed the moment was right. They were wrong about the moment. What they had not accounted for, in their calculation, was what the boy had become. He was no longer simply a strange and gifted child by the time Khan fell. He had grown into something that the steppe produced rarely and recognized immediately. A war leader, precise and cold-eyed and without the hesitation that costs lives in the crucial seconds of a fight. He gathered what force the Talaska could muster and he rode against the charade with the focused economy of a man who has made a decision and is now simply executing it. What followed was not a battle so much as a reckoning. The charade were razed, their camps reduced to ash, their herds scattered, their organization as a tribe brought to a decisive and permanent end. He did not enjoy it. Or if he did, that enjoyment left no record. What the record shows is simply that it was done, thoroughly and without apology, and that it was done in the name of a man who had given a child in the dust, a place to sleep and a reason to continue. The head of the charade's leader was mounted upon the boy's tent. In the 21st century of a more innocent age, such an act reads as barbarism, a trophy display, the gruesome punctuation of an act of violence. On the steppe of Chogoris, in the context of a culture that had developed over centuries of tribal warfare and hard-learned consequence, it was something considerably more precise. It was a message, written in the only language that certain kinds of power reliably understand. That language said, "I see you. I know what you are. I know what you are capable of, and I have demonstrated, without ambiguity, what I am capable of in return. The next tribe that weighs the cost of moving against those under my protection will know the weight of that cost before they act." It is a mathematics of deterrence as old as organized violence, the public establishment of a consequence so clear and so complete that the calculation of whether to repeat the provoking action becomes very simple. The charade had calculated wrongly. Their leader's head on the tent post was the correction to their arithmetic. No subsequent tribe that heard what had happened to the charade made the same error. The boy had not simply avenged on Khan. He had begun to build a reputation, and on the steppe, a reputation was a kind of armor. Standing in the aftermath of the charade's destruction, surveying the fractured landscape of Chogoris from whatever vantage point the steppe offered, the young Khan made a decision that would define everything that came after. Not a tactical decision, not a strategic one in the conventional military sense. A moral one. He swore an oath. What he swore against was the thing he saw most clearly as the true enemy of his people, not any single tribe, not any individual warlord, but the endless, grinding cycle of division itself. Tribe against tribe, blood feud following blood feud, the accumulated weight of generations of grievance keeping a whole people fractured and weak and unable to be more than the sum of their warring parts. He had lost his adoptive father to that cycle. He had watched it bleed the steppe dry of people and purpose and possibility for his entire young life. The oath he swore was not to conquer for its own sake, not to rule because he found the idea of ruling appealing. The oath was to end the fracture. To make something whole. To take this world of fierce and capable people and give them a reason to stop pointing their considerable capacity for violence at each other and look outward instead. It was a young man's oath, perhaps, in its ambition. But he kept it. He had no interest in the usual rituals of steppe politics. When rival Khans came to him, and they came, in increasing numbers, as his reputation grew and the evidence of his capabilities became difficult to ignore, they came bearing the traditional instruments of negotiation, offers of alliance, proposals of tribute, suggestions of marriage between bloodlines, the various currencies of power that the tribal world of Chogoris had developed over generations of practice. He rejected them. Not out of arrogance, and not because he was incapable of political thinking. He was, as those who knew him well could attest, an exceptionally subtle political thinker when he chose to be. He rejected them because he understood that an alliance built on negotiated advantage was an alliance that would dissolve the moment the advantage shifted. He wanted something more durable than that. So instead of accepting their tribute, he defeated their champions. One by one, the warriors that rival Khan sent to face him, their best fighters, selected precisely because they were believed unbeatable, were met on the ground and overcome. Efficiently, and without particular cruelty, but decisively and publicly. The message was not "I am stronger than you," though that was true. The message was, "What I am building here is real, and you cannot dismantle it by the usual means." The Khans who received that message clearly enough folded their banners and joined him. Most of them, eventually, did. Word of what was happening on the steppe reached the planetary governor sooner or later, as such things tend to do. The governor of Chogoris was not a native of the planet. That much is suggested by the records, though the details are sparse, and viewed the rapid unification taking place in the interior with the combination of alarm and contempt that remote administrators often bring to the autonomous organization of the people they nominally govern. A unified Chogoris was a problem. A unified Chogoris under the command of a figure this obviously capable was a considerably larger problem. The response was predictable: champions were dispatched. Then more champions. Then organized hunting packs, groups of fighters selected and trained specifically to find and eliminate the growing threat in the empty quarter. The young Khan defeated them all. It is worth sitting with that fact for a moment, because it is easy to let it pass too quickly. Not one challenger, not two, countless tribes and hunting parties, sent in succession by a governor with the resources of a planetary administration behind him, were met and overcome. Some by direct combat, some by the kind of maneuvering that turned an enemy's approach into a trap before they knew they were in one. Each victory added to the legend. Each failed attempt by the governor to extinguish the fire only made it burn more visibly. One of the first acts of the unified steppe, of the coalition of tribes that was beginning to coalesce around the young Khan's banner, was the institution of mandatory military service. This is worth noting not as a footnote but as a statement of intention. Mandatory service is an idea that changes a society deeply and permanently. It says that the defense of the collective is not the business of a warrior caste, not the privilege of those born into fighting families or the misfortune of those with no other options. It is everyone's business. Everyone's responsibility. The man who herds horses and the woman who works leather and the elder who tells the old stories, they are all, in the end, participants in the project of survival. On a world as demanding as Chogoris, this was not a particularly radical idea. But the formalization of it, the transformation of an informal expectation into a structured, universal requirement, was a significant step in the transformation of a collection of tribes into something that could reasonably be called a people. The young Khan was not simply a warlord accumulating followers. He was building institutions. He was thinking not just about how to win the next battle but about what kind of society would exist after the battles were done. It was a quality he would carry with him into the stars. He did not destroy the tribes he defeated. This is, in the full context of Chogoris' history, remarkable, and it is one of the things that made what he built different in kind from what had come before. The steppe had seen conquerors before. It had seen strong chieftains gather followers by force, and hold territory by intimidation and call themselves unified, when what they meant was subdued. That kind of unification was always temporary, because it was built on fear, and fear is only reliable for as long as the thing producing it remains present and overwhelming. He absorbed. That is the word the histories use, and it is the right one. The tribes that came within his orbit, whether through defeat in battle, through the persuasion of his reputation, or through the simple recognition that the alternative to joining was to be left behind in an increasingly connected world, were taken in rather than taken over. Their warriors became his warriors, yes, but their customs, their skill sets, their particular knowledges of specific terrains and weather patterns and animal behaviors were preserved and valued. A tribe of herders became herders within the larger coalition. A tribe of hunters became hunters in its service. He was building something diverse enough to handle whatever the steppe, and eventually the galaxy, threw at it. The strength of the many, held together by something more durable than force. He had no interest in cities. More precisely, he had no interest in the particular kind of stagnation that permanent settlement seemed, to his mind, to inevitably produce. A city is fixed. A city is a statement of permanence, a declaration that here we stop, here we plant ourselves and build walls and accumulate the things that walls protect. He had seen enough of what walls produced, not safety, but the illusion of safety, and worse, the gradual erosion of the mobility and alertness that kept a people genuinely alive. So he built sky halls. Mobile structures, great platforms and tented halls that could be loaded onto conveyances and moved across the steppe without the need to dismantle and rebuild from scratch each time the coalition needed to relocate. They were not small or crude. The accounts that survive describe them as genuinely impressive structures, capable of housing councils and ceremonies and the administrative functions of a governing body that covered enormous distances. They moved because he believed movement was health. They moved because he would not allow the coalition he was building to take root in any one spot and begin to think that spot was the point. The point was always the horizon. The point was always the next piece of open sky. The Pale Emperor, whoever he was, whatever the nature of his claim to Chogoris, did not survive the storm that the young Khan had been quietly assembling for years. The liberation of Chogoris was not a coup or a sudden uprising. It was the culmination of a long, patient, extraordinarily thorough piece of work, the building of a coalition so broad, so deeply rooted across the tribes of the steppe, that when it finally moved against the planetary authority it did so with the weight of a world behind it. The uprising was multi-tribal in the truest sense, not a single dominant faction using smaller allies as expendable tools, but a genuine alliance of peoples who had, over years of integration and shared purpose, come to understand themselves as parts of something larger. The Pale Emperor's forces were not incompetent. They were simply facing something they were not designed to face, a population that had decided, collectively and with considerable preparation, that the arrangement was over. When it was done, Chogoris was free. And the young man from the empty quarter, who had been found in the dust and given fire by an old Khan who saw something worth preserving, stood at the head of a united world. He had not yet met his father. That meeting was already on its way. The Emperor and the birth of the White Scars. The year was 865 of the 30th millennium, and the Great Crusade was already a vast and grinding thing, a century-long project of reunion and reconquest that had carried the Emperor's armies across thousands of light-years, reintegrating lost human civilizations and eliminating those threats that could not be integrated. It was into this context that the Emperor came to Chogoris, and he did not come quietly. He came with Horus at his side, the War Master-to-be, already the most celebrated of the Primarchs, whose name was spoken with a particular mixture of reverence and wariness across the Crusade's many theaters of operation. What must it have been like, to see them descend? The Emperor is difficult to imagine even through the accounts of those who were present. An overwhelming presence, something that existed at the edge of what the human mind could comfortably accommodate. And beside him, Horus, tall and charismatic and smiling, the kind of man who made you feel, upon meeting him, that you had been recognized and valued by someone whose recognition and valuation genuinely meant something. Two figures of enormous power, arriving on a world that had, quite independently and without any of their assistance, already solved the problem of its own unity. The young Khan had made himself. They were coming to make him something more. He knelt. The histories record this simply, almost without comment, as though it were an inevitable conclusion to a predetermined story. But those who read more carefully notice the small significant word that precedes it, only. He knelt, but only after weighing the cost of resistance. This is the detail that reveals character, because it tells us that the submission was chosen rather than reflexive, that it was the outcome of a genuine deliberative process rather than the automatic response of a man who had simply encountered something more powerful than himself and yielded accordingly. He was not a man who yielded automatically to power. He had spent his entire life demonstrating otherwise, defeating champions, absorbing rivals, building a coalition based on genuine conviction rather than mere force. When the Emperor arrived, he did not kneel immediately. He looked. He considered. He ran the calculation that he ran before any major decision. What are the actual costs and benefits here, assessed without the distortion of fear or flattery? What does resistance buy, and at what price? What does submission cost, and what does it provide? The answer he arrived at was the Emperor. The answer was yes. But it was his yes, reached by his own reasoning, not a surrender but a considered choice. That distinction mattered enormously to him, and it shaped everything about how he fulfilled the obligations he had just accepted. He did not kneel empty-handed, and he did not kneel silently. Before his knee touched the ground, there were terms. The Khan had been building and governing for long enough to understand that the moment of agreement, the moment before the formal submission, when all parties are still negotiating rather than simply executing, was the moment in which the shape of everything subsequent was determined. He used that moment well. He secured guarantees for Chogoris, that his homeworld would be treated as a valued part of the Imperium rather than a resource to be stripped and catalogued and forgotten. That its people would retain something of their own identity within the vast administrative machinery they were joining. And for his legion, which he had not yet met, but whose nature and culture he was already determining in principle, he secured autonomy. The White Scars would operate according to their own doctrine, their own customs, their own understanding of what warfare was for, and how it should be conducted. They would serve the Emperor, faithfully and completely. But they would serve him as themselves. The Emperor, whose understanding of men was as deep as his understanding of anything, agreed. Whether he had expected to be negotiated with by the son he had just found, the records do not say. One imagines he was not displeased. The 5th Legion was scattered. This is perhaps the first thing to understand about what the Khan inherited, not a coherent force waiting to be commanded, but a collection of companies dispersed across the breadth of the Great Crusade, many of them fighting under other Primarch's banners, some of them in corners of the galaxy so remote that reliable news of what was happening elsewhere took months to arrive. They did not know their father had been found. They did not know that the Primarch whose gene seed they carried had been located, had knelt before the Emperor, and was now waiting for them on a world of endless plains. The gathering took nearly a decade. Nearly a decade of patience, for a man who had lived his entire life in motion and considered stillness a form of dying. We can only speculate about how he spent those years, training, certainly, preparing for the moment when the Legion would finally be whole enough to be remade. Meeting with the Emperor and with those brothers whose Primarchs had already been found. Learning the shape of the crusade that he was now part of. But waiting, fundamentally. Waiting for the instrument that would be required to do what he had sworn, on a much larger stage, to do. It was perhaps the longest hunt of his life, and the quarry was his own people. When they were finally gathered, the companies arrived from their distant campaigns, the warriors assembled who had fought under strange banners and wondered about the father they had never known. He did not simply assume command and move them forward. To do so would have been to miss the point entirely. An army is not made by logistics and orders. An army is made by the thing that runs beneath the logistics and orders, the shared identity, the common story, the understanding of who we are and what we are for. He needed to give the 5th Legion those things before he could give them anything else. The ritual that followed is called the blooding. It was drawn from the traditions of the Chogorian steppe, the customs of the nomads among whom he had grown up, who understood that belonging must be earned and then marked, that the body must carry the evidence of the commitments the spirit has made. Each warrior was scarred and named anew. Not renamed in the bureaucratic sense of a new designation assigned from above, but renamed in the deep sense of a new identity accepted and inhabited. The scars were not punishment. They were signature, the mark of a bond as real and permanent as the flesh that bore it. When the blooding was complete, the legion that stood before him was not the same collection of disparate companies that had arrived. It was something new, and it was his. The Star Hunters. That had been their name before, a name that carried its own history, its own associations, its own accumulated weight of campaigns and sacrifices that the warriors who bore it had earned across years of service. He did not dismiss that history. He understood what names meant to those who had fought and bled under them. But the blooding had made a new thing, and a new thing required a new name, one that expressed what this legion now was, what it intended to be, what the Khan saw when he looked at the warriors his gene seed had shaped. The White Scars. The name arrived like the thing it described. Sudden, clean, unmistakable. It carried within it the memory of the ritual blades of the blooding, the pale lines cut into dark skin in the tradition of the steppe. It carried the image of movement across a white plain, the speed and freedom of the ride. It carried something of winter, and something of wind, and something of the kind of clarity that only comes when you are moving fast enough that all the unnecessary things fall away. The warriors who had been the Star Hunters took the new name and made it theirs with the same speed and thoroughness with which the Khan did most things. Within a generation of campaigns, the White Scars would make it one of the most feared names in the crusade. The Terran veterans were a complication that a lesser mind might have handled badly. These were men who had been fighting since before any Primarch was found. Long-service warriors of the original 5th Legion, formed in the Great Wars of Unity and the earliest years of the Crusade, who carried with them the traditions and identities of a legion that had existed without a Primarch for its entire active history. They had their own culture, their own ways, their own understanding of what the Legion was, and should be. And now a Primarch had arrived, bringing with him a homeworld's worth of customs and practices that were emphatically not theirs. He could have simply overwritten them. He had the authority, and the power, and a reasonable argument that the Legion's future required a unified culture, built on Chogorian foundations. Instead, he adopted them. Formally, in the manner of the steppe, the Terran veterans were taken in as kin, given the same Chogorian naming rights as the new warriors being raised from his homeworld, integrated into the Legion's culture rather than submerged beneath it. The message was that the White Scars was not a Chogorian legion that happened to contain some Terrans. It was something new, broad enough to hold everyone, built from the best of what all its components brought to it. It was, in miniature, what he had done with the tribes of Chogoris. He knew how to do this. He had been practicing for years. The naming rights of Chogoris were not a formality. On the steppe, a name was not simply what you were called, it was a declaration of who you were, what you owed, and to whom. A Chogorian name carried lineage and obligation and identity all at once, compressed into a few syllables that a person carried through their life as clearly as they carried their scars. To give someone a Chogorian name was to make them part of the web of kinship and responsibility that held steppe society together. To receive one was to accept that you were now accountable to that web. The Khan mandated these rights for all his warriors, Terran-born and Chogorian-born alike. Not as a token gesture of cultural flavor, but as a genuine binding. Every warrior of the White Scars, whatever their origin, was to carry a name that located them within the Legion's understanding of itself. They were brothers not in the abstract rhetorical sense that many legions claimed, but in the specific, concrete sense of people who had been formally adopted into the same kinship structure, who owed each other the particular obligations that Chogorian tradition attached to that relationship. It was a culture built on loyalty, but loyalty of a specific and demanding kind, not the loyalty of subordinates to a superior, but the loyalty of family members to each other. The difference was significant, and it showed in how the Legion fought. Entry into the White Scars was not given. It was earned, through a series of trials that the Khan designed and that came to be known collectively as the Path of the Sky Hunter. The name itself is instructive. A sky hunter is a bird of prey, something that operates in 3 dimensions, that is as comfortable in the vertical as in the horizontal, that hunts by speed and angle and the willingness to commit fully to the dive. The trials selected for something like that, the capacity for rapid decision-making under pressure, for spatial awareness in complex environments, for the combination of physical capability and tactical intelligence that the Khan's style of warfare demanded. These were not purely physical tests, though the physical demands were severe. They included navigation challenges, terrain reading exercises, exercises in the management of speed and the timing of commitment, when to hold, when to strike, how to read the space between yourself and your objective and use that space rather than simply cross it. Warriors who completed the path of the Sky Hunter were not just fighters. They were hunters in the fullest sense, capable of operating in any environment with the adaptability and precision that the Khan required. Those who could not reach that standard did not progress. The Legion was not interested in numbers. It was interested in the particular quality of warrior that the path produced. He had always listened to counsel. Not because he was indecisive, he was among the most decisive of the Primarchs, capable of committing to a course of action with a speed that left more cautious commanders blinking, but because he understood the value of perspectives that were not his own. A leader who surrounds himself with agreement is a leader who has constructed a comfortable blindness, and he had no patience for comfortable blindness. So he built the Kolan Circle. The Kolan Circle was an advisory council of the Legion's senior warriors, not a governing body in the bureaucratic sense, not a committee with formal powers of approval or veto, but a gathering of experienced voices that the Khan was genuinely willing to hear, and occasionally to be challenged by. The distinction is important. Many leaders create advisory bodies and then ignore them. The Kolan Circle had real influence, because the Khan had real respect for the warriors who composed it, and because he understood that the difference between a good decision and a disastrous one was often the quality of the thinking that had gone into it before it was made. He was a man of instinct, yes, but his instinct was disciplined by the habit of listening, and the circle was one of the primary instruments of that discipline. This, perhaps, is where the legend of the barbarian begins to crack most visibly for those who care to look closely. The Khan required his warriors to engage in what he called the noble pursuits, a category that included, centrally, two practices that the broader Imperium would not have associated with the fierce nomad warriors of the White Scars: calligraphy and saga telling. Calligraphy first. The careful, meditative drawing of characters, each stroke a discipline of breath and attention, the hand made precise by the same focused awareness that steadied a lance in the moment before a charge. There is a deep connection between the fine motor control required for beautiful calligraphy and the kind of body awareness that makes a warrior effective in close quarters. But the Khan's reasons went beyond the tactical. He believed that a man who could slow himself down enough to make something beautiful, who had the patience and the presence to care about the quality of each individual stroke, was a man in possession of himself in a way that violence alone could not produce. The saga-telling served a complementary purpose: the preservation and creation of narrative, the long oral histories of the steppe carried forward into an age of starships and bolters. A warrior who understood story understood what he was fighting for. He composed epics. The man who commanded a legion, who planned campaigns across star systems and fought in the vanguard of the greatest military undertaking in human history, he also sat down in the dark between stars and wrote poetry. Not as a hobby, not as a distraction from more serious concerns, but as a practice he considered as essential to his identity as the hunt or the fight. The sagas he composed are known mostly through fragments now, scattered through the oral traditions of the White Scars and the occasional reference in the historical record. Those fragments suggest something remarkable: a voice capable of the vast, windswept scale of the great steppe epics, but also of the precise, quietly devastating observation that characterizes the best short-form poetry. He was, by any fair assessment, a gifted writer. He was also a gifted linguist. The Khan spoke multiple dialects, the various tongues of Chogori's regions, the lingua franca of the Crusade, and enough of the languages of specific peoples and cultures he encountered to make himself genuinely understood rather than merely translated. This mattered to him. A man who speaks only through interpreters is always at one remove from the truth of what is being communicated. He preferred to close that distance. Language, like terrain, was something to be read directly and accurately, without the distortion of intermediaries. He required his warriors to master horseback riding. In the 41st millennium, aboard starships that crossed the void between stars, in the service of an imperium that measured its armies in millions and its territories in light-years, he required them to ride. To outsiders, this seemed like the most vivid possible confirmation of the barbarian thesis. Here was a Primarch so attached to the primitive customs of his homeworld that he was making his gene-forged warriors learn to sit on horses, as though the 10,000 years of technological development between the horse and the starship had simply not occurred. They were wrong, of course. They were nearly always wrong about him. Horsemanship, in the Chogorian tradition, was not about the horse. It was about the development of a specific and irreplaceable set of capacities, balance, rhythm, the ability to move in harmony with something that has its own will and its own unpredictability, the communication of intention through weight and pressure rather than words or controls. A rider learns to think in 3 dimensions. A rider learns to feel the ground through something that is not their own feet, to extend their spatial awareness beyond the boundary of their own body. A rider learns, most importantly, to be comfortable in motion, to be most alive and most effective when things are moving rather than still. This was precisely what the Khan wanted his warriors to be. The horses were the curriculum. The horsemanship was the lesson. The Storm Unleashed, Great Crusade Glory. Around the 980th year of the 30th millennium, the Khan led 5 brotherhoods out into the wild regions of uncharted space. Not as part of a larger combined advance, not alongside another Primarch's force with another Primarch's eyes on his movements, but independently, by his own heading, into the regions that the Great Crusade had not yet reached and where the shape of what would be found was entirely unknown. It was the assignment that suited him best, and it is difficult to avoid the suspicion that he had maneuvered to receive it. 5 brotherhoods was not a small force. But in the context of the Crusade, that enormous, galaxy-spanning undertaking involving the full strength of 20 legions and the combined resources of the nascent Imperium, it was a compact one. A force built for speed and independence rather than mass and attrition. A force that could move quickly, decide quickly, adapt to whatever it encountered without the procedural delays that attended larger, more complex military organizations. The Khan had designed it precisely for this kind of deployment, and he took it into the dark with the ease of a man who has spent his entire life moving towards unknown horizons and found them, without exception, navigable. The wild space ahead of him was simply the next version of the empty quarter. He had crossed that once before. There are gifts that come from the way a person is shaped by their early life, and the Khan's eidetic relationship with maps and terrain was one of his. Not the eidetic memory of the archivist who stores information and retrieves it accurately, though it included that, but something more active and more spatial. He absorbed the shape of a theater of war the way a musician absorbs a piece of music, not merely memorizing it but internalizing it, understanding it at a level below the verbal, so that it became available to him as intuition rather than recalled data. Staff officers who worked with him described something close to wonder at the phenomenon. He would review maps of an area once, sometimes less, and thereafter be able to navigate it in complete darkness, to describe the likely lines of approach available to an enemy force, to predict the defensive strongpoints that a particular configuration of terrain would produce, to identify the routes that looked viable on a map but would fail under the specific conditions of a particular season or weather pattern. It was not infallible, nothing is, but its reliability was high enough that experienced commanders who served under him learned to treat his spatial judgments with the same confidence they gave to hard sensor data. The land spoke to him, and he heard it clearly. The doctrine that emerged from the Khan's understanding of warfare, from his gifts, his experience, his philosophy of movement and the hunt, came to be called the Khan's hunt. It is worth understanding this not as a rigid set of maneuvers but as a philosophy expressed through tactics, a way of thinking about war that, once grasped, generated specific approaches rather than prescribing them. At its core, the Khan's hunt was built on a single insight: the enemy's strength is most usefully engaged not at its center but at its edge, and not when it is still but when it is moving. A stationary enemy in a prepared position is at its most dangerous. An enemy in motion, responding to pressure, adjusting to an unexpected development, that enemy has been partially disorganized already, their attention divided, their decision-making under time pressure. The hunt was about producing that state deliberately. Draw them out. Create a situation that demands their movement. Guide that movement, through apparent vulnerability or apparent opportunity, towards the ground you have chosen. And then, at the moment when their momentum is greatest and their organization least, strike with the full weight of forces that have been positioned precisely for this moment. It was the feigned retreat made into a complete doctrine. It was the steppe nomad's way of war elevated to the scale of a space marine legion. Within the broader doctrine of the Khan's hunt, there was a particular instrument that the Khan developed for the sharpest moments of any engagement: the Storm Squad. These were elite formations built for rapid insertion and targeted destruction. Small, extraordinarily able units capable of appearing from unexpected vectors, executing precise objectives with speed that larger formations could not match, and withdrawing before the enemy could organize an effective response. The Storm Squad concept was not new. The idea of a fast, elite strike unit predates the Great Crusade by millennia. What the Khan brought to it was a particular understanding of how such units should be integrated with the broader battle. They were not independent raiders. They were the killing stroke at the end of a long, careful setup, deployed at the moment when the hunt had done its work, when the enemy was off balance and exposed and the specific target of the Storm Squad's attention was at its most vulnerable. The coordination required was demanding, and the warriors who composed these units were selected from the best the path of the Sky Hunter had produced. They were the outermost edge of the blade, and they were kept sharp with the same discipline that the Khan brought to everything he valued. The campaign against the Diasporex gave the Khan his first true independent command at the scale of a full military operation, and it confronted him with a problem that a more conventional commander might have found genuinely frustrating. The enemy would not stay still. The Diasporex were a fleet-based civilization, a people who lived in their ships, who had no fixed territory to defend, who moved through space with the practiced ease of those for whom the void was home rather than passage. They were always beyond reach, always just across the next transit point, always able to scatter and regroup and scatter again when pressed. The Khan found this less troubling than it might have been. He understood mobile warfare at a level most of his contemporaries could only approximate, had been practicing it, in various forms, since the early campaigns on the plains of Chogoris. He adapted his approach with the flexibility that the Khan's hunt demanded, not chasing a fleet that would always be faster in pure transit, but understanding the routes and resources that such a fleet required, positioning his forces at the points of constraint, and then using pressure and maneuver to guide the Diasporex towards engagements they could not avoid. The campaign was a demonstration of what the White Scars could achieve when given room to operate on their own terms. The Crusade took note. The Ordoni Shard was an Orc empire, vast, grinding, enduring in the way that Orc civilizations tend to endure, through the simple fact that killing Orcs in sufficient numbers to matter is considerably harder than it sounds. The campaign to break it would have been, by conventional approaches, a long and expensive affair, system by system, world by world, the slow attrition of a species that breeds faster than it dies, and fights more enthusiastically with every reverse. The Khan chose a different method. He challenged the Orc warlord to ritual single combat. It was a gesture that spoke in a language the Orcs understood perfectly. They were, in their own brutal way, a culture built on the recognition of personal power, and a challenge issued at that register was a challenge that could not be ignored without cost. The warlord accepted. What followed was brief, by the standards of Primarch combat, and ended with the Khan standing and the warlord not. And with the warlord's death, the Ordoni Shard, that vast empire held together by the charisma and dominance of its central figure, began to fracture along every line that the warlord's presence had previously suppressed. The campaign that might have taken years was over in the time it took one man to walk forward and refuse to be afraid. It was, in its way, the empty quarter all over again. Find the center of gravity and strike it directly. Ullanor was the great triumph of the early crusade, the destruction of the largest Orc empire yet encountered, a campaign so significant that the Emperor himself appeared to lead the final assault, and at its conclusion named Horus Warmaster in a ceremony that those who were present would remember for the rest of their lives. It was a moment of extraordinary collective achievement, the crusade at its height, the Imperium's military at its most confident and unified. The Khan fought at Ullanor not at the head of a massed formation, not leading a brotherhood in the grand charges that the battle's scale invited, but as something considerably more precise. He was on jet bike, moving at speeds that made targeting him effectively a matter of luck as much as skill, threading through the chaos of the battlefield with the focus of a man who had identified exactly what he was looking for and was not interested in anything else. He found those targets. Orc leaders, coordination points, the threads that held the enemy's organization together. He cut them with the clinical efficiency of a man who understood that wars are not decided by the destruction of armies so much as by the destruction of the will and capacity to continue fighting. At Ullanor, he was the scalpel moving through the noise of what was, in every other respect, an operation that required sledgehammers. Both were necessary. He knew which one he was. The Irema compliance presented a different kind of problem. The world was defended by forces that had chosen to make their stand behind fortifications, a decision that, against most Crusade forces, was a reasonable one. Fortifications multiplied the effectiveness of defenders, forced attackers to accept casualties in the approach, and bought time for the kind of grinding resistance that sometimes produced the political will on the attacker's side to negotiate rather than press on. It was sound strategic thinking. Against the Khan, it was a mistake. He used feigned retreats. It is worth appreciating how ancient this tactic is and how difficult it is to execute correctly. The false retreat requires that the retreating force appears genuinely disorganized and vulnerable, that it moves quickly enough to create urgency in the pursuing enemy but not so quickly that the enemy declines to pursue, and that the forces designated to spring the trap are positioned with sufficient precision that the moment the retreating units turn, the outcome is no longer in doubt. Done badly, the feigned retreat becomes an actual rout. Done well, it is perhaps the most lethal tactical maneuver in the hunter's repertoire. The Khan had been doing it since the steppe campaigns of his youth. At Irema, he did it at legion scale, and the fortified defenders came out of their walls to chase what they believed was a broken force, and found themselves on ground that he had already chosen for exactly this purpose. Talon was a desert world, vast, arid, hostile in the particular way that desert environments are hostile, which is to say in ways that affect not just the body but the mind. Heat, sand, the disorientation that comes from featureless terrain that makes distance and direction difficult to judge, the exhaustion that accumulates faster than it seems to, in environments where water and shade are not freely available. Many forces that had been effective elsewhere found their capabilities degraded on Talon, unable to adapt their established methods to conditions that undermined the assumptions those methods were built on. The Khan adapted. This was not remarkable, it was simply what he did, because adaptability was not a skill he had developed as an addition to some other way of operating. It was foundational. The desert was another version of the steppe in its essential demand. You had to understand it on its own terms rather than trying to impose your preferred conditions on it. You had to move differently, supply differently, fight differently. You had to read the terrain with the same care you would give to any other theater, and build your tactics from what the terrain actually was, rather than what you wished it were. The desert warfare adaptations that emerged from the Talon campaigns were not simply a record of the White Scars having coped with difficult conditions. They were a genuine addition to the body of doctrine the Legion carried, lessons hard-learned that became available for every future campaign in similar environments. The Kolan Circle, that advisory council he had built to counsel and challenge him, occasionally served a harder purpose than counsel. The purges of Sengar and Vorgeist are not spoken of openly in the historical record. They appear in fragments, in allusions, in the careful oblique language that histories use when they are describing something that was considered necessary but not something that anyone involved wished to examine at length. What can be assembled from those fragments suggests that both figures had moved, in ways that the Khan found unacceptable, beyond what the Legion's culture and values permitted. He was not a man who permitted corruption to establish itself and then negotiated with it. He had seen, in the long history of the steppe, what happened when a leader allowed something rotten to persist in the body of what he had built, how it spread, how it found allies and built justifications, how by the time it was visible to everyone it was already far more difficult to remove than it would have been at the beginning. He acted early, quietly, and completely. The Circle served as both the instrument of the purges and their record. The senior warriors who had helped him build the Legion's identity were also the ones who helped him defend it. It was, in the end, what they were for. The Battle of the Burning Stars was fought not on a world, but around one, or rather, among the debris field of what had once been several worlds, shattered by some ancient catastrophe into a belt of asteroids that hung between two suns like the wreckage of an unfinished thought. Most fleet commanders, encountering such a battlefield, would have sought open space. The asteroid field offered too many variables, too many ways for engagements to become chaotic and unpredictable, too many surfaces from which an enemy could emerge unexpectedly. The Khan sought the asteroids. He had always understood that the most dangerous terrain for your enemy was often the terrain that they found most difficult to manage, and the asteroid field, which was genuinely threatening to formations that relied on massed movement and predictable firing lines, was perfectly suited to the hit-and-run approach that the White Scars had made their own. They moved through the debris with the ease of the experienced, using the rocks as cover, as ambush positions, as the edges of killing grounds that they had designated in advance. The traitor fleet that had believed the asteroid field gave them protection found instead that it had divided them into parcels, separated them from mutual support, and handed each parcel in turn to enemies who needed only a few seconds in a firing window to do lethal damage before disappearing back into the dark. Droon's compliance brought together three Primarchs: Jaghatai Khan, Horus, and Mortarion. It is a gathering that carries enormous retrospective weight, given what two of those three would later do and become. At the time, it was simply a campaign, complex enough to require the combined attention of multiple Legion commanders, prosecuted with the efficiency that Primarch cooperation could produce when the political chemistry was functional. The chemistry, in this particular combination, was mixed. Horus and the Khan had an easy familiarity, two men who recognized something in each other, who moved through the world with a similar kind of confidence, who shared a preference for decisive action over extended deliberation. Mortarion was more complicated. The Death Lord was a figure of enormous capability and equally enormous grievance, carrying within him a bitterness towards the Emperor that was visible to those who cared to look, even then. The Khan was not blind to it. He was not blind to much. But the campaign was completed, the compliance achieved, and the three Primarchs parted ways on terms that could be characterized, at minimum, as professional. What was coming, what Horus and Mortarion both were moving towards, even then, was still ahead. For now, there was only the work. The Night Lords were among the most terrifying of the Space Marine legions, not because they were the most powerful in the conventional military sense, but because they had elevated psychological warfare to an art form. Their boarding actions were the stuff of nightmares, designed with the specific intention of making nightmare a tactical instrument. Darkness, zero gravity, the sounds and smells of violence engineered to produce maximum terror in the target, the sense of something hunting you in the dark that you cannot see and cannot fight in any of the ways that training has prepared you for. They boarded the Swordstorm. The Khan was aboard. What followed has been reconstructed from the accounts of the survivors, White Scars veterans who fought in corridors without gravity, in darkness lit only by muzzle flash and the burning of equipment, against opponents who moved through those conditions with the practiced ease of long familiarity. The Khan fought personally, as he always fought. Forward, fast, without the defensive instinct that fear produces. He had encountered wild and dangerous things in the dark since childhood and had never learned to mistake the darkness itself for the danger. The Night Lords found him there, and they found that hunting a Primarch in his own ship was a considerably different proposition from hunting mortal men. The Swordstorm held. The Khan emerged. The Night Lords left. The warrior philosopher, beliefs and tensions. He was known as the Great Khan, and he was known as the Warhawk. The first title was the older one. It came from the steppe, from the tradition of calling the paramount chieftain by a title that distinguished him not merely as first among the tribe's leaders but as the leader of leaders, the one whose authority encompassed all the others. On Chogoris, the title had weight and history. In the Imperium, it became something slightly different, a way of acknowledging, without quite admitting the full implications, that this Primarch operated at a level of personal authority that exceeded what any formal rank could contain. The Warhawk was the Great Crusade's name for him, and it suited a different aspect of the same man. A Warhawk is a bird of prey that hunts in open air. Fast, far-sighted, capable of the kind of extended ranging flight that takes it far beyond the sight of those who released it, and yet always, eventually, striking with the precision that all that range and all that speed was in service of. It was a name that the wider crusade gave to the quality of the White Scars in battle, but it described the Khan precisely. A commander who ranged widely, who worked best in open space with room to maneuver, whose campaigns produced decisive results in ways that those who had only seen the ranging part could not quite explain. Both names, in the end, are accurate. Both are incomplete. He was larger than either of them. The barbarian assumption followed him everywhere, and he allowed it to. There is a certain strategic value in being underestimated by your peers, and the Khan, who thought about strategy in every context, not only the military ones, was not above exploiting that value deliberately. When the Crusade's administrators saw a Primarch whose legion rode horses and scarred their faces and came from a world they had never heard of, they filed him in a mental category and moved on. The category read, effective but crude. Useful but not sophisticated. Not the kind of figure whose opinions on civilizational policy or philosophical questions needed to be particularly solicited. They were wrong in almost every particular. The man who was being categorized as a barbarian was a poet of genuine accomplishment, a philosopher with views on the nature of freedom and society that were both coherent and challenging, a linguist who spoke multiple languages with native ease, a historian who had thought carefully about the long arcs of how civilizations rose and fell. He had read more than most of his brothers, thought more carefully about what he had read, and arrived at positions that were his own rather than assembled from the conventional wisdom of the moment. The assumption of crudeness was, in the end, a gift. It meant that when he finally chose to reveal the depth of his thinking, the surprise was complete. He preferred it that way. Stagnation bred heresy. This was not, for the Khan, a metaphor or a rhetorical flourish. It was a genuine analytical conclusion, arrived at through years of observation and thought, that he held with the same conviction he held his views on warfare and movement. The connection he drew was not obvious, but it was, once seen, difficult to unsee. Heresy, in the broad sense of a turning away from what an institution or a civilization is supposed to be, and towards something that serves different purposes entirely, did not, in his view, typically begin with a dramatic act of rebellion. It began with stasis. It began when people stopped questioning, stopped adapting, stopped asking whether the things they were doing still served the purposes those things were created for. When a system stops moving, it accumulates. Unexamined assumptions pile up. Institutional habits calcify into supposed necessities. The gap between what an organization claims to be and what it actually is widens, slowly, until it is so wide that those inside it can no longer see across it. And in that gap, in the space between the stated purpose and the actual practice, something else grows. Something that knows how to use the language of the original purpose while systematically emptying it of meaning. He had seen the beginning of this process in the tribes of Chogoris, in the planetary governor who had sent assassins against him, in every rigid structure that had mistaken its own continuity for its own virtue. He was seeing it now, in the early decades of the Imperium he had helped to build. The bureaucracy appalled him. Not in the way of a man who simply finds administrative work tedious. He was perfectly capable of dealing with the logistics and governance that came with commanding a legion, and he did so with characteristic competence. What appalled him was something more specific and more serious, the way in which the Imperium's administrative machinery had begun, in the decade since Unity, to prioritize its own processes over the purposes those processes were supposed to serve. He had watched it happen. He had watched worlds that could have been integrated swiftly and lightly instead become entangled in years of compliance procedures that served no purpose he could identify beyond the employment of compliance officers. He had watched resources that could have been deployed in the crusade be consumed by the maintenance of an administrative apparatus that existed, increasingly, to maintain itself. He had watched the gap between the Emperor's stated vision, a galaxy of free humans, united under the guidance of reason and science, and the shared project of species survival, and the actual practice of the Imperium widen with every year. He said so, when asked. He said so even when not asked. It was not a popular position among those whose careers were built on the management of that apparatus, and he was aware of this and declined to moderate his position on that account. He called it the Storm's freedom, and the phrase meant something precise to him, not simply something evocative. Freedom, in the Khan's philosophy, was not the absence of constraint. He was too experienced a leader and too honest a thinker to believe that pure unstructured freedom was either achievable or desirable. A storm is not free because it has no direction. A storm is free because its movement is entirely determined by its own nature and the forces that genuinely act upon it, rather than by artificial impediments placed in its path by those who find its movement inconvenient. The freedom he advocated for was of this kind, the freedom of the Legion to fight in the way that its nature and training and doctrine had equipped it to fight, without the kind of interference from above that was really the imposition of someone else's preferences on a situation those preferences were poorly suited to. The freedom to make decisions at the level at which those decisions actually needed to be made, without waiting for approval from layers of hierarchy that were too distant from the situation to understand it properly. It was a military philosophy, yes, but it was also a political one, and an ethical one. He believed that the beings who actually had to live and fight and die in a situation were generally better qualified to determine the appropriate response to it than those who observed from a distance. This belief made him difficult for certain of his brothers. It made him right rather often. He would not take the augmentations. In an age when cybernetic enhancement was available, accessible, and for many Space Marine leaders a straightforward tool of capability improvement, he declined it entirely. His body was his own, and he would keep it that way, the body he had been given, working in the ways it had been shaped to work, without the overlays and replacements that turned flesh into something more hybrid and less, in his estimation, alive. This was not stubbornness, though it looked like it to those who saw only the refusal. It was a position with philosophical depth behind it. He had thought carefully about what happened to people when they replaced the living parts of themselves with mechanical ones, not just physically, but in the more subtle registers of how they understood their own existence. There was a process he had observed, in those who underwent extensive enhancement, of gradually shifting identification from the biological to the mechanical, from the organic to the engineered. Something was lost in that shift, even when something was gained. The capacity for the kind of immediate, embodied experience that he considered essential to genuine understanding, the feel of the terrain beneath his feet, the weight of the weapon in his hand, the temperature of the air against his face, those things mattered. They were not inefficiencies to be overcome. They were information, arriving through channels that machinery could approximate but never quite replicate. In the private councils held aboard the Swordstorm, those gatherings of senior advisors and trusted warriors that took place away from the formal structures of Legion Command, the Khan drank kumis. The fermented mare's milk of the Chogorian steppe, pale and slightly sour and utterly unlike the more refined beverages that the Great Crusade's cosmopolitan culture had made available to those with the rank and taste for them. He had access to anything he wished to drink in the galaxy of the 30th millennium, and he chose the drink of nomads on an unremarkable world that most of the Imperium had never heard of. This was not nostalgia, though it contained an element of it. It was a statement of identity, deliberate and consistent. He was a man who knew exactly where he came from and saw no reason to be embarrassed about it, who understood that the customs and tastes and particular pleasures of the steppe were not inferior to the refined culture of the Crusade's more prominent centers, only different, and who maintained them as a matter of principle as much as preference. Those who attended his private councils and found a cup of kumis placed in front of them were receiving a message along with their drink. You are in a particular place now, and this particular place has its own customs, and if you wish to participate in it you will encounter those customs on their own terms. Most found, in time, that the drink was better than it sounded. The aviary aboard the Swordstorm was a private space, rarely spoken of in official records and mentioned only obliquely in the accounts of those who served closely enough to know it existed. It was not large. The demands of a warship do not readily accommodate large spaces devoted to non-military purposes, but it was carefully maintained, and its occupants were treated with an attention that the Khan gave to few things that could not fight back. The birds were hunting birds, as they had always been in his life since the first gerfalcon settled on his arm in the empty quarter. Whatever their specific species, and the birds changed over the decades, as birds will, replaced with new ones found on new worlds encountered in the course of the Crusade, they were always birds of prey. Fast, precise, built for the hunt. He trained them as he had always trained them, in the old Chogorian way that required patience and consistency and a particular quality of attention that was its own form of meditation. Those who observed him with the birds saw a version of him that the battlefield did not show. Still, unhurried, entirely present in the immediate moment, his focus so complete that the enormous machine of the Legion and the fleet seemed, for that hour, to have nothing to do with him. It was, by all accounts, the closest he came to rest. The rivalry with Rogel Dorn was real and persistent, and rooted in a difference so fundamental that it was not really possible to resolve, only to manage. Dorn was a builder of walls. Not metaphorically, though that too, literally, in the most direct sense. He understood warfare and civilization through the lens of fortification. The patient construction of positions that would endure, the assessment of every situation in terms of how it could be secured, the deep conviction that permanence and defense and the reliable strength of stone were the foundations on which everything worth having was built. The Khan understood the world through movement. Not simply as a military preference, but as a complete philosophical orientation. The belief that what was alive was what moved, what adapted, what refused to become fixed in any form long enough for that form to become a prison. These were not tactical disagreements. They were two different souls, each internally consistent, each genuinely convinced of its own rightness, each producing results that the other had to acknowledge even as it found the method incomprehensible. Dorn looked at the Khan's way of war and saw recklessness dressed up as philosophy. The Khan looked at Dorn's and saw stagnation with a very expensive stone facing. They respected each other's competence with the specific kind of respect that implies no warmth whatsoever. Guilliman and Dorn both, at various points in the decades of the Crusade, objected to the Khan's consistent absence from the political life of Terra. This was not an idle objection. The capital of the nascent Imperium was, in those years, a place where the great decisions were being made, not only military ones, but civilizational ones, the choices that would determine what kind of Imperium emerged from the Crusade's conclusion. The Primarchs who made themselves present at Terra, who participated in those conversations, who were willing to play the game of political influence that court life demanded, were shaping those decisions with every conversation and attendance and carefully managed impression. The Khan was elsewhere. He was always elsewhere. He was in the void, in the wild space beyond the Crusade's current frontier, on the jet bike threading through an asteroid field, aboard the Swordstorm composing verses in the small hours. He understood perfectly well what was happening on Terra and had, in fact, quite strong opinions about it, opinions that he expressed, when directly asked, with a clarity that made Guilliman and Dorn uncomfortable. He simply declined to compete for influence in a forum whose basic assumptions he found objectionable. It was not apathy. It was a deliberate refusal to lend legitimacy to a process he thought was producing exactly the kind of stagnated, politically calcified imperium he had been warning about. Magnus the Red was, in many ways, his most natural companion among the Primarchs. It is a pairing that surprises people who know only the surface of both men. The fierce nomad warlord and the vast crimson-skinned scholar of Prospero seem an unlikely match for genuine intellectual friendship. But beneath the surfaces, the connection is entirely legible. Both were thinkers who found the company of people who refused to think frustrating. Both were men who had built cultures on their homeworlds that were richer and more complex than the Imperium's prejudices about their origins allowed for. Both were, in different ways, considered eccentric or dangerous by brothers who were more comfortable with simpler formulations. Between them there was warmth, and something rarer, genuine intellectual engagement, the kind of conversation in which both participants are changed by the exchange rather than simply confirmed in positions they held before it began. Magnus could discuss the deep history of the warp with the same depth that he could discuss Chogorian poetry, and the Khan found that range genuinely compelling. They did not agree on everything, on psychic power and its risks. They held importantly different positions, as the Council of Nicaea would make clear. But disagreement, for two men of this quality, was more interesting than agreement. They were good for each other. The galaxy was not good to either of them. Horus saw in the Khan a kindred spirit. Whether that assessment was accurate is a question with a more complicated answer than it first appears, because Horus, whose understanding of people was among his greatest gifts, and eventually among his most dangerous tools, saw in people what he needed to see, and it is not always easy to separate his genuine perception from his deliberate cultivation of specific relationships for specific purposes. There was something real in it, certainly. Both men moved through the world with a kind of kinetic authority, a confidence in their own judgment that was not arrogance in the pejorative sense but simply the expression of minds that had been right often enough to trust themselves. Both preferred action to deliberation, outcome to process. Both were men who could be uncomfortable in formal contexts, who functioned best in the open rather than the chamber. Horus was not wrong that they shared these qualities. Where he may have overestimated the kinship was in assuming that the Khan's preference for freedom meant a preference for the particular kind of freedom that Horus was eventually going to offer. The Khan was free in the way of the storm. Self-directed, responsive to genuine forces, moving by its own nature. Horus, in the end, was offering freedom in the way of a cage whose door had been left open. The Khan was perceptive enough to notice the cage. Nicaea and the coming storm. The Council of Nicaea is one of those events in the history of the Imperium that seems, in retrospect, to gather significance with every year that passes, a moment that was already important when it happened, and has become more so as the consequences of what was decided there have accumulated across centuries. It was convened to address the question of the Legion's librarians, those warriors gifted with psychic ability whose role had become one of the most contested issues in the Great Crusade's later years. The Emperor called the council. The Primarchs attended. The galaxy held its breath, though it did not yet know what it was holding it for. The Khan came to Nicaea as he came to most things, having already thought about the question more carefully than his reputation would lead observers to expect, and having arrived at a position that was his own, rather than a convenient alignment with any existing faction. He was not a Primarch who found it comfortable to be on either of the obvious sides of contested questions. He distrusted obvious sides, which he tended to regard as the product of insufficient examination. The Nicaea question was genuinely difficult, and he knew it, and he was one of the few who was willing to say so in a forum where the pressure to declare a clear position was considerable. His argument at Nicaea was for limitation rather than prohibition. Not the unfettered use of psychic power. He understood the warp well enough, through the experience of watching his own Storm's ears operate and through the long conversations with Magnus that had given him more knowledge of the Immaterium than most of his brothers possessed, to take the risks seriously. But not prohibition either, the complete removal of librarians from Legion service, the suppression of a capability that had proven its value in campaigns across the length of the Crusade. He stood in the council chamber and made the case for a middle path. Controlled, disciplined, limited use under oversight, designed to prevent the excesses that had prompted the council in the first place. It was a characteristically pragmatic position, built not on principle in the abstract but on assessment of what was actually true about the situation. Psychic power was real, and it was useful, and its risks were manageable with sufficient care. The answer was care, not denial. He made this argument clearly and without apology, knowing that it would satisfy neither the faction that wanted full suppression nor the faction that wanted full freedom, which is usually the fate of the position that is actually correct. The Edict of Nicaea came down in favor of suppression. The Emperor's ruling was clear. The librarians were to be stood down, their psychic practices curtailed, the warp left unmanipulated by the legions except in the most extreme circumstances. The Khan accepted the ruling. He had disagreed with it, argued against it, believed it was the wrong decision, and he accepted it, because that was what it meant to have bent the knee on Chogoris. Not blind obedience, but the recognition that the authority he had chosen to acknowledge was the authority whose decisions he was bound by, even the ones he found wrong. But he did not leave the matter entirely without his own response. Jaghatai Yesige, the White Scar's chief stormseer, perhaps the most gifted psychic practitioner in the Legion, a man of deep knowledge and extraordinary discretion, was not simply stood down and placed on the shelf. The Khan assigned him to covert roles. Work that continued to make use of Yesige's gifts, but below the threshold of official record, in ways that the letter of the edict did not clearly prohibit. Whether this constituted defiance of the Emperor's ruling is a question that different historians have answered differently. What it constituted, in the Khan's own understanding, was the difference between accepting a bad decision and allowing it to strip you of every tool that the decision-maker's reasoning had failed to adequately account for. The warning came through channels that Nicaea had specifically prohibited. Magnus the Red. Brilliant, reckless, already halfway across the line that would eventually consume him, reached across the warp with a psychic sending of extraordinary power and range, directed at the Khan with the kind of deliberate, precise targeting that only a Primarch of his gifts could achieve. The sending was not text or speech but impression, the shape of a catastrophe already in motion, the knowledge that Horus had turned, that the heresy was real and immediate and coming faster than anyone outside the traitor inner circle understood. It was, in its form, exactly the thing that Nicaea had ruled against, a large-scale, unsanctioned use of psychic power by a Primarch who had been specifically ordered to restrain himself. Magnus was, in this act, both warning a brother and destroying himself, or rather accelerating a destruction already set in motion by choices he had made long before. The Khan received the sending. He sat with what it told him. He did not immediately act, because he was a man who did not act on a single source without verification, however vivid and however trusted the source. He began, instead, to gather information. To investigate. To find out, through the more conventional channels that remained available to him, whether what the Warp Raven had shown him was real. The Thousand Suns had been on Prospero. The Space Wolves had gone there, under orders that the full circumstances of which were still unclear, and what they had done was thorough. Survivors existed, scattered, shattered, carrying within them the terrible transformations that Magnus's bargain had begun to produce, and the Khan found them. He did not delegate this to subordinates. He interrogated them personally, with the same focused attention he brought to the study of terrain or the preparation of a campaign plan. What he wanted to know was the truth of Prospero. Not the official version, not Russ's version, not the version that the Crusades' command structure had settled on as the account that best served the interests of those who would have to live with what had happened. He wanted the actual sequence of events, the actual motivations, the actual understanding of what the order to burn Prospero had meant and where it had come from and what its consequences were for the larger picture he was trying to assemble. The survivors gave him what they could. Fragmentary, distorted by trauma, filtered through the perspective of those who had been on the receiving end of the action rather than its direction. But fragments were what he was working with across the board, and he was good at assembling pictures from fragments. What assembled itself was deeply troubling. His relationship with Leman Russ had never been warm. The two Primarchs were not natural companions. Where the Khan moved with the fluid adaptability of water finding its own level, Russ moved with the directness of an axe, and found the Khan's subtlety at best unnecessary and at worst evasive. Russ was a man of great loyalty and great conviction who found complexity in situations where he had decided clarity was appropriate to be a kind of intellectual bad faith, and the Khan had an unfortunate habit of being complex in precisely those situations. The destruction of Prospero brought this tension to its most serious point. The Khan could not look at what had happened there, an entire world burned, a legion destroyed, a Primarch driven into the arms of chaos at least partly by the manner in which the Emperor's justice had been administered, and see the clean necessary act that Russ appeared to see when he looked at the same events. He saw waste. He saw a catastrophic failure of discernment, the application of overwhelming force to a situation that required something more precise and more thoughtful. He said so to Russ. Directly and without diplomatic softening, in the manner of a man who had long ago decided that honesty was more useful than tact in situations where the stakes were high enough. Russ found this intolerable. The Khan found Russ's inability to tolerate it confirming. The Kondax campaign was a necessary war against Orc forces in a distant system, and it should have been, by the standards of the Great Crusade's later years, a relatively straightforward undertaking for a force of the White Scar's capabilities. It was not. The warp storms that arrived as the campaign was reaching its conclusion were of a scale and persistence that no natural phenomenon could easily explain. Vast disruptions in the Immaterium that severed reliable communication with the broader Imperium, delayed transit, and left the White Scars effectively isolated from news of what was happening in the rest of the galaxy. He knew, by that point, that something had happened. Yesige confirmed it, in the indirect way that the Stormseer communicated certainties that could not be officially acknowledged. The nature of the storms, their timing, their distribution, their effect, spoke clearly to anyone with the knowledge to read it. This was not natural. This was the opening movement of something that had been planned, the deliberate use of warp disturbance as a strategic instrument to delay and confuse forces that the enemy could not yet openly confront. Kondax had become a holding cage. The question was not whether to leave, but how, and what he would find when he did. He had a clear and terrible suspicion about the answer to the second question, and he was right. Messages came from both sides. Horus sent word, carefully and persuasively, offering the version of events that he had crafted for each brother's particular vulnerabilities and values. For the Khan, it was framed in the language of freedom. The Emperor's dream had become the Imperium's cage. The great project of human liberation had calcified into exactly the bureaucratic stagnation that the Khan had been objecting to for decades, and here was the chance to break it open and begin again. Horus knew his brother well enough to identify the argument most likely to resonate, and he was not wrong that it would resonate. It did resonate. That was part of what made the deliberation take as long as it did. Against this the Khan set everything else he knew, the burning of Prospero, the nature of what he could piece together about the forces Horus had actually aligned himself with, the implications of what the Warpraven had shown him, the full shape of the choice as he could assemble it from all available information. He was not going to be rushed. He was not going to be flattered into a decision or frightened into one. He sat with it, in the Chogorian tradition of a man who owes a decision the full weight of his attention, and he arrived at his answer when he had finished rather than when it was convenient for anyone else. The answer was the Emperor. Not because the Imperium was perfect, he knew it was not, had said so repeatedly, would say so again. Because the alternative was not freedom. It was a different ruin, wearing freedom's face. The Horus heresy, the storm breaks. The rejection of Horus was not accompanied by dramatic words or formal declarations. It was not the kind of moment that the saga tellers would later be able to make much of, because it produced no single scene that could be described, no confrontation, no exchange, no memorable act of defiance. The Khan simply stopped responding to the Warmaster's overtures, turned the white scars away from the direction those overtures had been trying to lead them, and began moving towards terror. The decision was the action. There was nothing else to add. Those who had expected him to be susceptible to Horus's arguments understood him less well than they believed. The freedom argument was compelling, yes, but compelling arguments are what Horus was best at, and the Khan had spent his entire life being suspicious of compelling arguments precisely because he understood how well they could serve purposes that had nothing to do with the truth they claimed to illuminate. He had examined the offer with the same cold clarity he brought to difficult terrain and found, beneath the rhetoric of liberation, the thing he had learned to recognize from a very long apprenticeship: the structure of a cage. Freedom offered by someone who needs your compliance is not freedom. He had known that since the step. He applied it here. Before he turned fully towards terror, there was unfinished business. The remnants of the Thousand Suns, those survivors of Prospero who had been scattered into the void, carrying within them the transformations that Magnus's pact had begun and that were accelerating with every passing month, drew his attention for reasons that were both tactical and, in their way, personal. He had interrogated the survivors at Kondax. He had assembled as complete a picture as the available evidence permitted of what had happened on Prospero and why. He was not finished with the implications of that picture. He pursued them with the focused efficiency of a man who understood that the heresy's opening moves had created a number of loose and dangerous elements in the galaxy, and that the responsible course of action was to account for as many of them as possible before they could be used against the loyalist cause. The Thousand Suns remnants were not simply tragic figures, they were dangerous ones, their psychic capabilities warped and amplified by the transformations they had undergone, capable of significant harm if organized and directed by someone with the will and knowledge to use them. He dealt with them as he dealt with every tactical problem. Directly, completely, and without leaving more loose ends than he had started with. He arrived at Terra to find the siege already underway. The traitor host gathered at the walls of the Imperial Palace in numbers that made the mind resist the full comprehension of the scale. The Khan looked at this and made his assessment with characteristic speed. The siege could not be won quickly from outside the walls, not by conventional means, but it could be made significantly more expensive for the traitors if they were denied one of the key instruments of a prolonged siege operation. That instrument was orbital supremacy. The White Scars went to work above Terra with the aggressive unpredictability that had defined the Legion since the Khan's hunt had first been conceived on the plains of Chogoris. Not fleet battles in the conventional sense, not the massed engagements of capital ships exchanging ordnance across set firing distances, but a sustained campaign of denial, using speed and misdirection to make the space above Terra costly and uncertain. Every supply run that was intercepted, every reinforcement that arrived diminished or delayed, every traitor captain who had to devote resources to protecting logistics rather than prosecuting the siege, these were the contributions of a force that understood how to multiply its effective strength by targeting the systems that made everything else possible. The ground below was a fortress. The space above it was a hunt. Rogel Dorn had built the defense of the Imperial Palace with his usual extraordinary thoroughness. Layered positions, interlocking fields of fire, every strongpoint mutually supporting, every approach channeled and covered. It was, by the standards of siege defense, a masterwork. The Khan looked at it and began conducting guerrilla sallies from the walls anyway. This was not recklessness. He had thought about it carefully, from the perspective of someone who had spent his entire career thinking about what happened when a defending force became too static. The traitor host was immense and aggressive, but it was also an organized military force with its own command structure and its own vulnerabilities that a purely defensive posture would never be able to exploit. By launching fast targeted sallies into the besieging forces, the Khan disrupted their organization, denied them the settled rhythm that a prolonged siege required, and forced their commanders to devote planning attention to defending against attacks that could come from unexpected directions at unexpected times. Dorn objected, on the grounds that the forces committed to sallies were forces that could not be recovered if they were lost. The Khan persisted, on the grounds that the forces committed to purely passive defense were guaranteed to be consumed regardless. The great displacement of the siege had created pockets of Imperial forces cut off behind the traitor lines, isolated garrisons, small units that had been overrun by the speed of the traitor advance, soldiers who had found themselves suddenly on the wrong side of a front that had shifted overnight. They were not dead, these people. They were surviving, in the particular grim and inventive way of soldiers who have decided that survival is the mission now, holding positions that had ceased to have any strategic meaning except the meaning of the lives of the people holding them. He went to get them. It was not a simple decision, viewed from the cold calculus of strategic resource allocation, the forces required, the risk to the Khan himself, the value of the rescued versus the cost of the rescue. He did not make decisions from that calculus, not when people who could be saved were available to be saved. He gathered what he needed, cut through the traitor lines with the speed and precision that made such operations achievable for the White Scars in ways they would not have been for anyone else, and brought people out who had already begun the internal process of accepting that they were going to die there. That they did not die there is, in its own small way, one of the more human stories of a siege whose scale tended to dwarf the individual. Mortarion came to the spaceport. The Death Lord, once a brother, now something that had been a brother, arrived with his great scythe, silence, and the full weight of Nurgle's gifts. The toxins that worked through armor, the psychic emanations of decay, the sheer presence of a being so thoroughly transformed by chaos that proximity to him was itself a tactical disadvantage. He was, in the context of what the heresy had produced, one of the most dangerous close combat opponents in the galaxy. He had been a formidable fighter before his fall. What he was now went considerably beyond formidable. The Khan met him. This was not a tactical choice in any conventional sense, it was a choice in the older register, the one he had been making since the day he challenged Orc warlords and rival Khans, the choice to stand in the open and be judged. The siege was not going to be decided by whether he personally fought Mortarion. Other things would decide that. But the Spaceport needed to hold, and the Death Lord had come to it, and so he was here. They fought among the wreckage and the bodies of lesser warriors, two Primarchs whose history contained an entire crusade of shared campaigns and private understanding, now reduced to the simplest possible statement of what they had become. The Scythe found him. There is no way to reconstruct the exact moment, the accounts are fragmentary and the witnesses were fighting for their own lives, but the consensus is that the Khan took a wound that, by any reasonable assessment of what a weapon of silence's nature could do, should have been the end. The blade connected. The toxins that Mortarion's gifts had infused into the weapon were in the wound. The Death Lord had maintained the distance that his fighting style required, the distance at which his capabilities were overwhelming and his opponents were reduced to mere speed against a force designed to negate it. What the Khan did next is the part of the story that the White Scars tell in the saga tradition he had built for them. He grabbed the blade. He took the cutting edge of silence in his hands, already wounded, already poisoned, already by the logic of the fight in a position from which there was no good outcome, and he used it as a rail, pulling himself along it, through the wound it was making, closing the distance that Mortarion had spent the entire fight maintaining. It was not a calculated tactical maneuver. It was the act of a man who had decided, in the deep place below conscious thought where the real decisions are made, that he was not going to die here, and that the way to not die here was to get close enough to do what he had always done at close range. Mortarion withdrew. The Spaceport held. He did not die, though the wound was serious enough and the toxins sufficient enough that those who found him in the immediate aftermath apparently found something very close to a worst-case scenario. The resilience of a Primarch is difficult to fully comprehend. The physiology that the Emperor built into them goes considerably beyond the already extraordinary capabilities of a Space Marine, in ways that touch on the fundamental nature of what they are. They are hard to kill. They recover from things that would kill anything else, if given enough time and enough of whatever their particular physiology requires to repair itself. He required time. He required care and quiet, and whatever the White Scars apothecaries could provide in the chaos of a siege that was still ongoing around them. He received these things, and he used them, and he recovered, not quickly, by his own standards, but completely. What had been done to him by the Scythe and by Mortarion's gifts was undone, piece by piece, by a body that had been refusing to be permanently damaged since the first time a Thunderwolf had decided to test the limits of the strange boy from the empty quarter. The Spaceport remained in Imperial hands. The siege continued for a while longer. He was there for the rest of it. The long scouring. 70 years. It is worth holding that number for a moment, because it tends to pass too quickly in the reading, a number mentioned and moved past, when what it represents deserves considerably more weight. 70 years of active campaigning, in the aftermath of the most catastrophic war in human history, chasing the remnants of the traitor legions across a galaxy that was still burning from what those legions had done to it. 70 years of the Great Scouring, that vast grinding pursuit operation that followed the heresy's conclusion and sought to complete what the siege had begun. The destruction or exile of every force that had turned against the Emperor. For a man who had spent his entire life in motion, it was perhaps the most natural continuation imaginable. The scouring was, in its essential structure, a hunt, exactly the kind of operation his doctrine and his temperament and his decades of practice had best equipped him for. The quarry was vast and dangerous and spread across more territory than any single force could efficiently cover, and it required the constant adaptation and creative route finding that the Khan's hunt had been built for. He threw himself into it with the same focused energy he had brought to every campaign before it, and for 70 years the White Scars moved through the scouring like a wind through a plain, reaching everywhere, touching everything, leaving in their wake the evidence of a force that had passed through and dealt with what it found. Roboute Guilliman had produced the Codex Astartes during the scouring's middle years, and it was already reshaping the political and military landscape of the nascent Imperium by the time its full implications became clear. The Codex was many things. A comprehensive manual of space marine tactics and doctrine, a framework for Legion organization, and most significantly, a prescription for the breaking of the legions themselves into the smaller formations that would become the chapters. It was, as strategic documents go, a work of remarkable ambition and considerable wisdom, addressing as it did the genuine vulnerability that the heresy had revealed, the danger of concentrating so much military power in so few hands. The Khan supported it. He did not support it enthusiastically, and he did not support it silently, and those who expected him to fall in line without comment received instead a precise and clearly expressed account of what he found correct in Guilliman's reasoning, and what he found incomplete. The breaking of the legions addressed one problem and created others, and he named the others. The standardization of doctrine across what would become hundreds of separate chapters was, in his view, a bureaucratization of the very kind he had spent his career criticizing, the conversion of living, adaptive military culture into fixed institutional practice. He said so. And then he supported the Codex anyway, because the argument for it was sufficient, and because he had learned, on Chogoris and again before the Emperor, the difference between battles worth fighting and battles that cost more than they gained. He allowed the Legion to split. The White Scars became chapters, the First Brotherhood and its successors dispersed, the great organization he had built from the ritual of the blooding divided into the smaller formations that the Codex required. He oversaw this with the same attention he had given to the Legion's original construction, ensuring that the division was done in ways that preserved what he considered essential. The culture, the naming rights, the noble pursuits, the philosophical foundation that made the White Scar something more than an effective military force. The new chapters carried these things with them. Each one was, in the Chogorian tradition of the absorbed tribe, a continuation of the original rather than a replacement for it, different in scale and in some of its specific practices, but recognizable in its essential character. The Khan had built something robust enough to survive being distributed across multiple organizations, and that robustness was itself a kind of achievement. Most things that are divided lose themselves in the division. The White Scars tradition survived it, and survives still, in the chapters that carry the legacy of the Great Khan across a galaxy that continues to need them. He returned to Chogoris, the homeworld that had made him. The plains and the empty quarter and the sky that had always been the most constant presence of his life, received him after decades of absence with the particular quality of welcome that a place gives to someone who has not changed in the ways that matter. The steppe was as it had always been. The wind still carried ice and grit in equal measure. The Gerfalcon still rode the thermals above the plains. The sky was still immense and indifferent and completely honest in the way that only very large and ancient things can be. He gave to Chogoris the great Kargan's orations. These were not the addresses of a returning conqueror cataloguing his achievements, not the political speeches of a ruler securing his position. They were something older and more essential, the act of a man accounting for what had happened, and to whom, and at what cost, standing before the people whose world he had once unified and speaking the names of the dead. The oral tradition of Chogoris had always understood that the dead required this, that grief not spoken in the presence of community became grief that isolated and corroded, and that the naming of the lost was a form of respect owed to those who had given everything. He named them. All of them he could name. The orations went on for days. The sky temples he built for the fallen were unlike any other memorial structures in the Imperium, and unlike them in ways that were entirely intentional. The Imperium tended towards monument, the great stone edifices of the fortress monasteries, the statues and victory columns and commemorative plaques that anchored memory to fixed points on fixed worlds, that said, "Here is where we remember, and here is where you must come to do it." He built differently. His sky temples reached upward. They were structures designed not to anchor but to open. Tall, spare, built with attention to the quality of light at particular times of day, constructed so that the wind moved through them rather than being excluded by them, so that the sky was visible from within them rather than replaced by ceiling. They were built on Chogoris, in the tradition of a people who had always related to the sacred through the open sky, rather than the enclosed space, and they were built for the dead of the White Scars, for the warriors who had fallen at the siege and in the scouring and in every campaign before, whose scars would never be added to, whose names had been spoken in the orations and now required a permanent place in which to be remembered. They did not trap memory. They offered it to the wind, in the belief that what the wind carries, it carries far. The Last Hunt, Disappearance and Myth. The Drukari came to Chogoris and to Carousel 5 with the particular brutality that had characterized their raid since long before the Imperium existed. They were not a new enemy. The Dark Eldar, as those who encountered them without sufficient knowledge of the distinction called them, had been conducting this kind of operation for millennia. Fast, surgical strikes from the hidden architecture of the webway, appearing without warning, taking what they came for, and disappearing back through portals that closed behind them before any response could be organized. What they took was people. Living beings, collected for purposes that Imperial records do not examine closely, that the survivors of their raids described in terms that do not lend themselves to comfortable documentation. That they struck Chogoris, his homeworld, the world he had unified and returned to, and built sky temples upon, was not, in the end, what precipitated what followed. The Khan had been fighting enemies who threatened civilian populations his entire life, and he had always responded proportionally and professionally. What precipitated what followed was simpler and more direct. They had gone somewhere they should not have gone, taken people they should not have taken, and left a trail. He had spent his whole life following trails. He was going to follow this one. The webway portal was located. How? Through the intelligence capabilities of the White Scars, through Yesugei's gifts operating in their covert capacity, through the kind of patient investigation that the Khan had always been willing to commit to when the quarry was important enough, is not recorded with the specificity that later historians would have preferred. What is recorded is the decision that followed. He gathered the First Brotherhood, the finest warriors of his legion, the closest to him in practice and in philosophy, the ones who had been with him through the longest arc of what the White Scars were, and he led them to the portal. There is a moment, described by those who were present but not among the Brotherhood, of the Khan standing at the threshold of the portal and looking through it into the webway's impossible interior. One account describes him as entirely still, the man who had lived his entire life in motion, standing without moving for what felt like a long time, his eyes on the space beyond. Then he moved. The First Brotherhood followed him, because that was what it meant to be the First Brotherhood. You followed the Khan through whatever door he chose to walk through, because he had never yet chosen wrong. The portal closed. That is the entirety of what can be said with certainty about what happened after. The portal closed, and Jaghatai Khan and the First Brotherhood did not come back through it. The year was 084, 31st Millennium. The White Scars waited, for days, for weeks, for months, with the particular kind of waiting that soldiers do when they are not yet ready to accept the conclusion that the waiting is trying to tell them. They searched the webway's accessible edges. They sent messages through every channel that might reach someone inside the webway. They received nothing in return. The maelstrom, that vast, churning region of warp disturbance that the webway skirted and occasionally intersected, was considered. Whether the Khan had moved into it deliberately, had been pushed into it by enemies, had been drawn into it by some characteristic of the webway's interior that had not been apparent from outside. None of these could be established. He was simply gone. The word the White Scars used, in the saga tradition, was not dead. They did not say he was dead. They said he had ridden ahead, as the great Khan had always ridden ahead of those who followed him, into ground that had not yet been seen. They said the scouting was ongoing. His last recorded words were not a farewell. They were not spoken with the weight of a man preparing for an ending, were not composed with the care that a person brings to a statement they know posterity will examine. They were said in the way that he said most things. Directly, without ceremony, with the tone of a fact being stated rather than a sentiment being expressed. 5 words. And then he was through the portal. The hunt is not over. It is possible to hear these words in several registers. As a military statement, the campaign against the Drukhari was not concluded, and he was continuing it by the most direct means available. As a philosophical statement, the great hunt, the pursuit of understanding, of freedom, of the horizon that was always moving ahead of those who chased it, did not end with any single engagement or any single lifetime. As a personal statement, I am not done. I have not reached the place where a man puts down his weapons and considers himself finished. The hunt is not over because I am not finished with it. He had always moved towards the horizon. The portal was another horizon. He walked towards it as he had walked towards every horizon before it, without hesitation, without looking back, with the fire still burning behind his eyes. On Chogoris, if the rumors are to be believed, there is a cache of gene seed. Hidden somewhere in the landscape of that world of open plains and wide sky, not in any official repository, not catalogued in any administratum record, but preserved in a place and a manner known only to those who have kept the secret across the generations since the Khan departed. His gene seed, kept against possibilities that may or may not still be relevant, maintained by those who decline to accept that the departure through the webway portal was the final word on the subject. This is either a practical provision, the act of a Primarch who understood the value of genetic legacy and wished to ensure that what he had built could continue regardless of what happened to him, or it is something more personal. The act of a man who intended to come back and wanted the means of continuation kept ready for when he did. Both interpretations are consistent with what we know of him. He was a practical thinker who planned for contingencies, and he was a man who had never yet conceded a hunt as finished while the quarry remained at large. The cache, if it exists, says what the White Scars have always said since the portal closed: the accounting is not complete. The story does not end here. They say he still hunts in Komora, the Dark City, that vast and terrible metropolis hidden in the broken spaces of the webway, the seat of Drukhari civilization, a place so ancient and so complex that its full geography has never been mapped even by those who have lived within it for millennia, contains something that moves in ways that even its inhabitants find difficult to explain. Something fast, in a place populated by beings for whom speed is a lifestyle and a religion. Something that knows the terrain with an intimacy that should not be possible for anyone who arrived there from outside, but that speaks to the work of a very long apprenticeship in the corridors and shadows of a place where wrong turns are fatal. The Drukhari are not a people who acknowledge fear easily. They are ancient beyond the measure of the younger races, sophisticated in their cruelty beyond what most minds wish to contemplate, and they have outlasted empires that believed themselves permanent. But the stories that circulate in their city, in the arenas and the homunculi laboratories and the spires of the cabals, speak of something hunting. Something that targets the hunters. Something that has learned, over whatever span of time has passed inside the webway since a portal closed in 084 31st millennium, the layout of a city so complex it defeats most minds, and is using that knowledge with a patience and a precision that are entirely consistent with a man who learned to track thunderwolves as a boy and never stopped. He told them the hunt was not over. Perhaps he was simply being accurate. Perhaps, in the dark between worlds, in the city of those who took what was his, the great Khan is still moving, still reading the terrain, still planning the strike, still the boy from the empty quarter with fire behind his eyes and a horizon always ahead of him. The galaxy does not offer many certainties. This is not one of them. But it is, in its way, a comfort. That somewhere in the dark, something hunts. That the White Scar's father has not yet put down his weapons and called the accounting done. That the wind is still moving, and where the wind moves, it carries him. Sleep now, and dream of open skies and endless plains. Dream of the sound of riding, the thunder of hooves on frost-hard ground, the rush of cold air, the horizon always there ahead. He is out there somewhere. The hunt is not over. And in the telling of his story, across whatever dark and quiet hours surround you now, something of him rides still.